Hi everyone, it's Carol from the Barrie Public Library. Welcome back to my sewing room. Today I'm going to show everyone how to make this really cute little backpack. It's all fully lined and it's a handy little bag for your children, for yourself. You can use it to pick up a couple of books from the library. It opens up very easily. It's got the straps on the side, and then you just close it up. These go over the shoulders, and away you go. So a good hands-free bag for whatever you may need it for. Okay, so for our project, you're going to need 1.25 yards to 1.5 yards of fabric. A yard of fabric, a half yard for the exterior, a half yard for the lining, and then you're going to use about 1/4 yard. If you want to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, have a little bit of fabric left over, then you may want to pick up a 1/2 yard. So we're going to use the additional fabric to make our straps and to make our casings. And we're going to be making little loop squares as well. So the little loop squares are this part here that your straps feed through, and the casing is the part up at the top that's attached to the top of the bag that the handles all feed through. For the outside of the bag, we're going to cut 2 rectangles that are 17 inches tall by 15 inches wide. For our lining, now you can do it, like I said, the same fabric or a different fabric, and again, you're going to cut 2 rectangles that are 17 inches tall by 15 inches wide. Then we're going to cut 2 casing strips that are 14 inches long by 3 inches wide, and 2 of these little tab squares. They are 3 inches wide by 3 inches tall. For our straps, we're going to cut out 3 strips of fabric that are 2 inches wide, and they're going to be the width of fabric, and that's for 2 of them. And then the third one, we're going to cut the same length, and then we're going to cut it in half. So what we're doing is we're making 2 straps that are about 60 inches long. So most of the project is going to be sewn with a 1/2 inch seam. The only parts that are not, your casing strip, you're going to press a 1/4 inch on the inside. So turn it over 1/4 inch, press it, and then we're going to stitch that down. It's just so that we have a clean edge that's not going to fray for our casing. So we'll do that on both sides of the casing strips. Take your little tab strip, you're going to fold it in half and press it, and then where that press line is in the middle of the piece, you're going to fold your edges in to meet that. So you've got your 3 inch square, and it's now considerably narrower. And then we're going to fold that in half again, like that. And we're just going to stitch about 1/8 inch from the edge to hold it down and make our little tab. Well, our final size for our tabs, it's going to be 3 inches tall by about 3/4 inch wide, and then we will, once we've stitched it, when we get into using it in the bag, we end up with 1 inch long. And I am using my multi-purpose A foot because most of the bag is going to be stitched with a 1/2 inch seam. You want to have a foot that you can move your needle over so that you've got a 1/2 inch from your needle to the edge of the foot. It just makes it a lot easier, and it makes your seam a lot more consistent. So let's get started. Okay, so with my casing strips, I've just stitched in that 1/4 inch seam on either end. Now we're going to take them and we're going to fold them in half, and we're going to press that. A couple of little strips that are 13.5 inches long, because we've used 1/4 of an inch on each end, and instead of being 3 inches wide, they're 1.5 inches. So I'm going to take one of our outside pieces of our bag. We're going to take one of our casing strips, and the open edge is going to be placed along the top of our front of our bag. To make sure that everything is completely centered, a good way to do it is just fold your strip of fabric in half, press a little seam, and then that crease is right in the middle of this piece of fabric. And then I'm going to take my casing strip, fold it in half, press a little seam, and the lining fabric, I'm going to do the same. And then we're going to take our casing strip, we're going to line those edges up so the open part is lined up with the top edge of the outside of your bag, and those little seams that we pressed will meet in the middle. Then we're going to take our lining fabric and we're going to put it right side down. So we're going to make this neat little sandwich here. Clip it in place. I'm probably going to use about 4 or 5 little clips here. You could use a couple of pins. So we've got our casing sandwiched in between the outside of our bag and our piece of lining. And I'm going to do the same with the other piece. So we're going to take this over to the machine, and both sides we're going to just stitch a 1/2 inch wide from the edge, 1/2 inch from the edge, and stitch down. We're ready to sew. I like to use little scraps of fabric called leaders when I'm sewing. Works especially well if you're using narrow or small strips of fabric, like our little tab strips. So when I sewed that down, I start with the leader, stitch onto that, stitch down to the end, and then place this in right behind it and carry on my stitching. Especially with small pieces of fabric, your fabric can get sucked into the machine, into the feed dogs of the machine. So if you use one of these little leader strips, it stops that from happening. Moved my needle over to the left in order to make sure that I had a 1/2 inch from where my needle touches the fabric to the edge of the fabric. So we've got our outside of our bag, our casing strip, and our lining here. We've got a 1/2 inch from our needle to the right side of our foot, and that means our seam is going to consistently be a 1/2 inch wide, and that's what we want all through the project. Few stitches forward, stitch back to lock it in place, and then we're just going to stitch the 1/2 inch seam all the way down. Now where my casing is, I'm just going to reinforce it by doing a couple of stitches back and forth, and I will do it when I get to the other end of where the casing is. And like the little tabs, the casings are going to take some wear just with the opening and closing and pulling on the bag to open and close it. So if you could reinforce it a little bit at this stage. So I'm just going to do a couple of forwards and backs just to reinforce. And we're coming up to the edge, and forward and back. Okay, so that's the front side of our bag and the lining for it. And now we're just going to tuck the back side of our bag and the lining for it. If you're using pins, when you come up to them, pull them out, because it's not good for your needle or your machine if you sew over top of the pin. It can throw the timing out on your machine. You can break a needle, and that's never a good thing. Trust me on that. I've had that happen. Okay, so I've got the casing stitched in to the front and the back of my bag. And I'll show you. There we go. We've got that casing in the middle, and it's just poking up out between the layers. So we'll take this over to the ironing board and press it. We want to press the seam that we made towards our lining fabric, and our casing, which is on the outside of our stitched together pieces, we're going to press towards the exterior fabric for the bag. So if I show this to you, there's our seam. It's going to the left, and our casing is going to the right. And we're doing that for both the front and the back side that we stitched. With the front piece, these little tabs that we made, remember the 3/4 of an inch by 3-inch tall tabs? We're going to take those and we're going to fold them in half. And we're going to give them a press. Now, on the front side of our bag, we're going to take these 2 little tabs and we're going to insert them 2.5 inches up on the sides. What we want to do is we want to place it so that the open edge, same as we did with the casing, the open edge is going to be to the outside edge of the top of our bag front. And then I'm going to move over to the other side of my bag, and 2.5 inches up from the bottom edge on the side of the bag. So the open part of the tab is to the edge, and the closed part is to the inside on both sides. So this is the front side and its lining. And now we're going to take the back side and its lining, and we're going to line everything up and pin it together. So you want your seams between your lining and your outside to match up on both. So in both cases, your seam is going to go towards your lining, and that way you know the casing is facing in the same direction for both. And I'm just going to put a clip there. So where our linings join up, I'm going to move over about 4 inches, because we're going to flip the whole bag right side out through this opening, and then we'll close it again once we're done. Okay, so we are going to go back to the machine and we are going to start stitching. We're going to start where I've got this one clip on the lining. I'm going to do my back stitch, so I'm going to stitch forward a few stitches, stitch back, and then go around and just sew all around the perimeter until we get to this other clip. Okay, here we go. And we're just going to go all around the outside edge with our 1/2 inch seam here. When we come to where those tabs are, we'll feel those on the inside, and we are just going to do a little bit of back stitching forward and back over top of that, just to reinforce that area.